Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, Episode 7. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Sebastian Rotella, an award-winning investigative journalist, foreign correspondent, and author. Since 2010, he has been senior reporter at ProPublica, covering international issues including intelligence, terrorism, and organized crime. Before that, he worked for 23 years at the Los Angeles Times, serving as a correspondent in Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. He won a Peabody Award, the Moores Cabot Prize for Latin American Reporting, Italy's Urbino Press Award for American Journalists, and prizes from the Overseas Press Club, the German Marshall Fund, Columbia University, and other organizations. In addition to that, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2005 and 2020. He's currently a finalist for the Tom Renner Award, presented by the Investigative Reporters and Editors Association, for reporting on organized crime for his article, How a Chinese American Gangster Transformed Money Laundering for Drug Cartels. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what brings us to our conversation today. We are not doing a specific China-focused podcast as we've done on some previous episodes, but one that looks at the intersection of China and some of the most pressing issues here in the United States and are near abroad. Sebastian, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. The article that you wrote, part one of a two-part series, if I understand correctly, focuses in on this unique character that was kind of at the cutting edge of a dastardly business. Can you tell us a little bit about how you, with all of your previous work, how did you end up coming into this topic and focusing in on this character?
Well, it's a pleasure to be on the show, Steve. Thanks very much. And it was an interesting journey to do this story. As you said, I'd covered Latin America and organized crime and drug trafficking and the cartels at the Mexican border for many years. And in the past couple of years, my investigative focus has been on different kinds of PRC, Chinese malign activity around the world, transnational repression, espionage, other things. And one of the things, in really immersing myself in that topic, which was relatively new to me, that sources were saying in the national security community here and abroad, was that this convergence of Chinese organized crime and the Chinese state was something interesting to look at. And specifically, what came to my attention was something I hadn't realized in a world that I knew well, which was how quietly but relentlessly and dramatically Chinese organized crime had come to dominate the laundering of money for Mexican and Central American drug cartels of profits made in the United States. And that this had really been a revolutionary development that had empowered Chinese organized crime, that had empowered the cartels, that had really transformed the international underworld. And I found that fascinating. And there were several investigations, primarily by the DEA, that sort of cast a light on that. And you're always looking for a specific case that kind of sums up the bigger picture. And this case that you mentioned about this Chinese Mexican-American gangster named Ziji Li was one that really attracted me and that I dove into and found all kinds of connections and all kinds of interesting revelations.
Well, I have to imagine, jumping into a topic like this, that you made lots of really cool friends and maybe a few dangerous enemies, and sort of poking around at who's involved with these worlds. I mean, over the course of my career, we've usually looked at these things as three different silos. People would know about organized crime and those kinds of activities in Asia. People knew about cartels in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, there would be different intersections with affinity organizations or migrant communities coming to the United States. But this is a really interesting nexus that brings these issues together. And I think I'd like to try to walk through some of the policy issues that we are dealing with in the United States, and then with each of them, take it back into your work about how it exists in this three-part ecosystem that you've covered. One of them is the southern border for the United States. A lot of times we've seen stories talking about migrant flows, whether they come from Central or further south in America, up through Mexico and across the border. Occasionally, we'll see people of other nationalities come through. In recent weeks, there's been an uptick of reporting of Chinese nationals that have been among those migrants coming up into the United States. Now, that's a little bit off dead center of what you were looking at in this financial network. But in what way does that border the nature of those flows and kind of that policy feed back into the permissive environment that allowed your main character to exist and do what he did?
Well, I think it fits in a number of ways. I mean, he's an interesting character because I said he's born in southern China, but comes to Baja California, to the border city of Mexicali near Tijuana when he's about 10, grows up or spends those formative years in Mexico, and then immigrates again legally to Southern California. So he's really, because he has these three cultures, right? Chinese, Mexican, and American, and the languages and the context. He's sort of positioned to be an underworld figure that creates new alliances. But to your specific point, he is someone who starts out, and there's evidence that his family was involved in, with connections to the Chinese triad, the 14K, in smuggling of people and smuggling of drugs at the Mexican border, right? Smuggling of Chinese migrants in particular, quite sophisticated operations, smuggling Chinese migrants. This is going back to the late 80s, early 90s, but smuggling of Chinese migrants through Cuba, through to Mexico and into the United States, and through other routes, and using things like border tunnels and planes and things like that. So he was quite sort of involved in sophisticated multiple forms of drug smuggling and people smuggling. And he evolves from that at a certain point. He realizes later on in his career, when he flees to Mexico and sets himself up in Mexico and Guatemala, that the real money to be made, so to speak, is in the money business and the money laundering business. But he's able to come to that and help create this new criminal empire, thanks to his sort of coming up in this culture that combines, as those cultures do at the border, smuggling of all kinds of people and things and those kinds of and fraudulent documents and those kind of criminal networks.
Well, I definitely want to get to the money laundering part because I think there's a little bit of an education we'd all benefit from in diving into that. And you've got a unique research angle on that nexus. Before we get to that, though, for many of us who sort of have watched in public affairs and policy making, when we're talking about Chinese communist influence in the Western Hemisphere, it was usually in sort of opportunistic efforts to bring projects or maybe investments in. They would struggle to try to take diplomatic relations away from Taiwan. But this is going a whole different level beyond what that sort of mercantilist or opportunistic diplomatic or political warfare approach was by the Communist Party of China. This is actual criminal elements that are merging into a life with the cartels. So first, given that you've really covered Latin America well, how common or rare is it for an outside group or person to be accepted by the cartels as someone that is okay to trust and work with? I mean, that's of itself seems to be quite a leap. Here's a guy that is Chinese and just showing up. Yeah, he might be a criminal in similar businesses, but that's kind of the competition. How did the cartels come to accept a person like this?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think you're right. I think the cartels tend to accept these kinds of outside figures for two reasons. One, that there's some sort of connection through, usually through diaspora, that creates some kind of trust connection. And two, that they offer a service that is useful and valuable, right? The previous example would be, and I did quite a bit about work of this some years ago, there's a big Lebanese diaspora in Latin America, and there was a period in which Iran-connected, Hezbollah-connected underworld figures in Latin America were some of the prime money launderers for the cartels. And they took advantage of the fact that they had a longstanding diaspora presence in places like Mexico and had connections to Mexican organized crime and the cartels and offered that service. This is somewhat similar. The Ziji Li and people like him take advantage of the small but notable and growing presence, of Chinese diaspora communities in places like Mexicali and Tijuana. Don't forget, because as you know well, the Chinese Exclusion Act, back in the 19th century, pushes Chinese people out of the United States and into some of the northern border regions of Mexico. So those communities go back 100 years, and I covered them while covering people smuggling and other things in northern Mexico in the 1990s. So he's got those kinds of connections, and he's got personal connections. He's someone who has multiple wives and girlfriends, some of whom are Chinese, but one of whom is Mexican and has cartel connections herself. So he established his connections that way. And then
So he literally married into the mob.
He literally marries into the mob, and when he moves down, there's a point where he's a rising drug trafficker in 2008, and he's almost caught in an undercover operation in Los Angeles County. He flees to Mexico, sets up shop there in Guatemala, and his new romantic interest is actually a Chinese immigrant who's connected to Chinese Mexican figures involved in drug trafficking. So he has and who become one of his gateways into sort of finding laundering clients. So both in sort of structural and personal ways, and I've covered people like this around the world, there's a certain trans-border agility, transcultural agility, translinguistic agility that he has that enables him to execute this, as you say, this rather remarkable feat, in this very violent world. He and other Chinese launderers are handling cartel money, yet there isn't that much violence as they go about sort of taking over this laundering market. It's, they offer a service that is so fast and so cheap and so efficient and does such a benefit to the cartels. There's almost a sense like, they have the golden, they're laying the golden eggs. Don't mess with them. So it's quite remarkable how they do it and how it's kind of quiet and nonviolent, but transformative.
Well, you in your article, you make pretty clear and in a crisp way what the value proposition was. And most of us that are just engaged in legitimate business wouldn't have any idea what the normal percentage cut was from major money laundering operations around the world. Those Lebanese or others, what they were charging the cartels. But in your article, you sort of put the orders of magnitude of the old way of doing this was taking 15 or a higher percentage cut. And when you're dealing in billions and billions of dollars getting washed, that's a lot of money that's getting lost in the cycle. And the value proposition that this unique and odd person was able to propose is something in the order of magnitude of 1% to 2%. That is wildly cheaper. So it had to be business-wise just immensely attractive to the cartels. Had to imagine they might have thought it was too good to be true at first. But they seem to have tried it out and run with it quite a long stretch. But talk a little bit about the actual money laundering process. So in this kind of org chart that you were diving into, how did that process work?
It's fascinating, and so many. I tried to talk. I'm an expert on money laundering in the sense that I've covered it, but I'm by no means a financial expert. So I talked to a lot of DEA, IRS, HSI, and others, and all of them marveled at the math of it and at what you just said. How it was seemed almost too good to be true, and how ingenious and it was, and what a benefit it was to all involved. But to try and simplify it, you have this situation. Until sort of the rise of Chinese money laundering, you have mainly Colombian and to some extent Lebanese specialists doing the laundering for the Mexican cartels. They charged, as you said, as much as 15 to 18%, and it could take a while. It could take weeks or even months. And so that created all kinds of problems, infrastructure and security problems for the cartels. They have to pay more. They have to wait on the money. They have to stockpile the money, because don't forget, these are dollars being made on the streets, mountains of dollars being made on the streets of American cities that they want to bring back to Mexico and turn into pesos and launder in to the large extent in south of the border. So it took a while. It was risky. The money's exposed to being confiscated by the police or to ripoffs, things like that. So Ziji Li, when he comes in, he sees that he's got these two market forces. He's got the cartels that have all these dollars that they want to turn into pesos and want to get rid of. And there is this huge amount of Chinese elite, wealthy Chinese in China, many of them in the Communist Party elite, who desperately want to get their fortunes offshore and get a hold of dollars and are willing to lose money in the process. So what he offers the cartels is this: I will say $350,000 on the streets of Chicago. I will, your guy will turn it over to my guy. A signal will be sent to my people down in Mexico, and within 24 hours, you get the equivalent amount in pesos for 1 or 2%. So it's, it goes from weeks to a day. And I guarantee that if the money's lost, I'll take care of it. I'll take the cost, because he's making so much money on the other side of that equation. The Chinese wealthy who are buying those dollars, they or their representatives or their relatives on the streets of the United States are willing to lose money to pay high commissions of 10% or more to get dollars, right? And then he does something even more innovative, because he has them do what are called mirror transactions. They give him the money in China, moving it to in Chinese currency to accounts he controls, right? The equivalent amount of money. And he sells that money again, a second time, for a healthy commission to import-export firms doing business in China, mainly Latin American ones that need to do business in Chinese currency and that move then goods into the Americas. Sometimes they also help him mask the transactions or provide paper trails for the cartels to help the laundering. But so he sets this up, and again, it goes from it's fast and cheap and guaranteed, and it solves a huge problem for the cartels and makes everybody rich, and only worsens one of the great national security threats faced by the countries of the Americas.
Which is one of the reasons why the Chinese government probably is okay with what's going on in this cycle. But that's a subject we'll deal with a little bit later in our conversation. But I think some people might be familiar with the concept of a hawala that was largely talked about moving money in and out of the Middle East, or where basically you would have two sides, and money might shift in the United States from one account to another, and then a parallel transaction would take place in Saudi Arabia or Lebanon or somewhere else. Money hasn't moved between countries. It's just moved between people or accounts on either side, but somehow the two parties involved are okay. This one you got is an order of magnitude more complicated, and it's got sort of this triangular, similar parallel exchange going on. And this criminal is kind of a genius in a way, because he's making a huge amount with this 3-cycle washing machine going. And I think a lot of people probably wouldn't understand how powerful that demand signal was from the wealthy Chinese desperately wanting to get that money out. So, I think people understand cartels in the drug business, arms business, people smuggling business, whatever. They've got their demand, but they think of China chugging ahead as this economy that's earning a lot of money. Some people are getting rich in good or bad ways, but they're sort of prisoner in their own wealth in their country. And so this I think was the big cork that fueled this triangle, maybe more than the money flows that were going up and into the United States. This flow out of the need to flow money out of China, I think is something that most analysts of China, most people reading the American news wouldn't really have much of a grasp for. Do I have that about right in your estimation? And sort of the energy and the profits, was that leg of this triangle the real boom for this gangster guy?
I think that's right, because I think in the past decade, as you know better than I do, the administration of Xi Jinping has cracked down selectively and politically on corruption, but there has been, the wealthy in China feel more pressure and have more difficulty. There's always been an underground banking system and what's called the flying money system, right, going back decades. But that, there's all this wealth being made, but there's more pressure, there's more vulnerability. That fortunes are made, but all of a sudden they're lost. And there was also limits placed, I believe $50,000 at some point on how much money could legally be taken out of China. So all these things kind of push the wealthy, the Chinese elite into the arms of people like Xi Jinping, in terms of taking advantage of something that I think exists around the world in diaspora communities, which is this huge quantity of business done in cash. You know what I mean? And taking full advantage of that and harnessing it and making that kind of criminal marriage the demand and supply side with the cartels.
When we talk about cash, these days we have multiple kinds of cash. What role does digital currency play in this kind of a swampy nexus? The case you were looking at seemed to be primarily just hard currency. But is there a role for digital currency in this, whether it's a Chinese digital currency or otherwise?
I think there is. I mean, I think, as you say, in this case, it didn't really come up as a money laundering mechanism because there was so much being just sent through Chinese banks and Chinese businesses, and it was all about cash and sort of and more traditional structures. But many of the people, who come up in this case are involved in one kind of cryptocurrency activity or another, including scams. And I was just reporting, in fact, in Europe. And seeing some similarities in money laundering and this kind of Chinese crime offering this service. And there are definitely cases in which cryptocurrency is coming more and more to the fore. So I haven't studied them as well, but that is definitely something that is also emerging as Chinese organized crime around the world really is specializing in this kind of laundering cash supply service, as a sort of criminal enterprise.
Well, I do think it's a topic of interest generally. What the uses are and the fates is of the digital yuan, the Chinese currency. It seems to be one of the few government approved vehicles to be able to engage in these kinds of things. So we'll see where that might take us. But when you talk about this nexus, you sort of can intuitively understand how the criminal element of the Chinese triads or their organized crime might benefit. You can understand how the cartels benefit. In your research and the people you've talked to, is there any clear tie back to the Chinese government or the Communist Party? Is there sort of a theory of how the Chinese Communist Party itself might be benefiting from this?
Yes, I mean, this was obviously it's a difficult area. Most of the people we talked to, both frontline investigators and high-level national security officials, and we talked to dozens of them, current and former U.S. and foreign, felt that within varying degrees of certainty, and some more than others, but that they all sort of agreed that they felt the Chinese government was aware of it, and in the words of Admiral Fowler, the former head of Southcom, that he said, to us on the record, at least tacitly supporting the money laundering. Right. And there was all kinds of evidence for that in the case we looked at and others. One is the structural issue of you have an authoritarian, the most formidable authoritarian police state on the planet, watching, which has incredible control of its diaspora, not to mention its own territory and its own economy, seeing enormous amounts of money flowing in and out of banks and businesses in a way, as one DEA investigator said, that there's no way that this was, normal business activity, and allowing it to happen. You had on WeChat open, this business, much of it happened on the Chinese, ecosystem of communication, WeChat, and which the Chinese government obviously monitors aggressively. It was also happening there, right? I mean, you've had banks, Chinese banks in the United States and in Europe, fined and even prosecuted for allowing, criminal proceeds to flow through them. And then there was considerable evidence of specific individual connections of Xi Jinping and others involved in his network of contact with Chinese officials, whether as individual clients, theoretically people corrupt elite who were, his people who he was laundering money for, or he had a fraudulent document business whose clients included at least one senior military officer, whom he sold a real fake Guatemalan passport to. So, that sort of raises another question of, is he providing services in exchange for being allowed to do this business to Chinese officials? He had contacts with Chinese officials under diplomatic cover in the United States, according to investigators going back several decades. So there's a lot of indications, both in this specific case and we quoted a high-level State Department official as well, saying, we are seeing more and more of this activity, and often it's hard for us to see how much of it is just gangsters, how much of it is gangsters working with corrupt officials, or how much of it is gangsters being allowed to operate, right? I mean, so it's a difficult area, but I think there's a lot of evidence pointing in that direction. And again, if you read the article, we try to phrase it as carefully and judicially as possible, but I think we have strong on the record sourcing about both individuals and Chinese institutions that are involved that lead to, the strong indication that the Chinese state is at least aware of and tacitly involved in, and perhaps more actively involved in this kind of activity.
Yeah, it does. I mean, in a world where the Chinese government is virulently cracking down on young people in Hong Kong who use the wrong slogan, anyone who posts an image of Winnie the Pooh offends apparently the soft sensibilities of Xi Jinping personally. And anyone who talks about Taiwan in an unapproved way can get zapped pretty hard and fast on WeChat and other platforms. It is kind of implausible that these kinds of activities could take place on that kind of a network and go completely undetected. And if they were detected, then there's at least the passive allowance of it moving forward. But can you give a sense of the narrative in your article is focused mostly on activity that's taking place outside the United States? Is that correct? But there obviously was flow into the United States, and U.S. authorities were involved in all of this. But there seemed to be a lot of the comings and goings of this guy and the business had a lot to do with Latin America and Asia back and forth, and then that other part of the triangle, definitely part of the mix, but a lot of the activity was there. Is there any sense for how widespread this kind of a money laundering cycle is in the United States itself? Was this something that was something that involved a flow into and out of the United States, but the hub is really this Latin America-Asia nexus? Or is this actually a pretty big deal within the United States and a growing concern here at home?
Well, there are aspects of it that are a big deal in the United States and are growing concern. The command and control is Mexico and Guatemala. He has a casino in particular in Guatemala where he kind of brings together the two sides of the equation, the Latin American drug lords and the Chinese elite, to kind of show to both sides that he can deliver, right? Mm-hmm. But after all, this money, is being made and passed from the Mexican organizations to his organization on the streets of the United States in about 11 cities, right? And he has lots of operatives working in the United States who move back and forth between the United States, Latin America, and China, right? So there's a lot, and then again the Chinese elite who are getting the service from him, getting the dollars, are receiving it in the United States and doing things like buying homes. I was surprised to find this out, but there's a certain amount of home buying that still goes on in the United States in cash in diaspora communities, and or paying for tuitions or making investments. So there is a big part of it that goes on in the United States, and that is worrisome. And in the second part of the article, we looked in particular at one of his close partners who had been Tao Liu, who had been down in Mexico and Guatemala with him, and was kind of instrumental in helping him develop this idea and bring him into touch with wealthy Chinese, who then pops up in New York and, at this point, a wanted criminal in China, but embarks on what, the FBI and the DEA believe to have been a political influence operation where he's cultivating both Democratic, but particularly Republican politicians and campaign contributors, and ends up in rather a short period of time managing to meet twice with President Donald Trump, right? So, I mean, and that is a suspected political influence operation involving what appears to be a criminal who's being allowed to do his criminal schemes, including this money laundering, in exchange for working with the Chinese security forces. It's quite murky, and we explored it in the second part of the series. But yes, you have a lot of activity going on in the United States that is of great concern in the United States.
Well, it seems like there's some pretty clear needs that need to be addressed, and some capabilities that will need to be enhanced. Because I mean, in some ways, Chinese triads don't need encryption in their communications if too few of us even understand their language and are not active on their platforms. So we're going to need to have a lot more capability for more people to be doing what you did in this article in the sort of public sphere, but also in the government sphere if we're going to have a capabilities increase to be able to deal with this. But I wanted to shift gears just a tiny bit. And I think one of the sources that you had quoted in the first article was David Asher, who is a friend of mine worked together in the Bush administration. We were looking at North Korea and a lot of illicit activities that North Korea was involved in. But David really became one of the nation's leading experts on this netherworld of laundering of many different kinds, everything from illegal cigarettes to illegal currencies and a whole host of things. And going after North Korea, was deeply involved in that. But in your article, and this is where David sort of popped into my mind, you talk about two of the big the big government banks in China were involved in some of these transactions. And when we were working on the North Korea challenge, it was when the United States government was willing and able to warn China that one of their big policy banks was a potential target as a money laundering concern. That's when they actually started to crack down on North Korea to bring them to the negotiating table. And so I wondered, as you looked at this, did you get any indication of whether your sources that were former government or even off the record current government, were they looking at what can the United States do to try to incentivize or pressure the Chinese government to try to crack down on some elements of this money laundering and criminal element?
I think they were, and I think the question of banks, which after all are Chinese banks, which many of which are state institutions, is fundamental, and there was a lot of focus on that, both on the sort of straightforward organized crime side and more on the counterintelligence side. Just to give one concrete, what I think is one of the best examples in the world is in Spain, the ICBC, which I believe has been or may still be one of the biggest bank in China, is a state bank. Its four top executives were prosecuted and convicted by Spanish police, who found that they opened a branch of the ICBC in Spain and Madrid and industrially set about laundering, suitcases and carloads full of cash that showed up at this bank from people involved, Chinese diaspora folks involved in criminal activity day and night, and through all kinds of brazen and illicit means, moving this money back to China, right, and assisting in laundering and capital flight and tax evasion and contraband and everything else. So it kind of shows. And one of these executives actually had gone on to be a Europe-wide, Luxembourg-based executive overseeing ICBC activities in the rest of Europe. So there was some suspicion if this is going on so brazenly in Spain, what else is going on elsewhere? And there have been Chinese banks fined. There was one in New York State that we cite in the story, fined a healthy fine for not following money laundering procedures. So I think there's pressure to have Chinese banks do the basic things that other banks do. Which
Exactly.
There's several countries, several cases in the United States, in Spain, and in France, and Italy that I'm aware of off the top of my head, where authorities have found themselves investigating, not like a teller, but high-level people in banks that are not doing the kind of due diligence that banks, which after all are supposed to be very regulated, both, by the state that they pertain to and the state they're in, that this was going on. So I think it's a matter of great concern. And one of them, as you said, in a top-down society where there's remarkable control of institutions and individuals, both at home and abroad, it's hard to believe that when these kinds of things are going on in state institutions, that there's some awareness or tolerance or approval of what's going on. Some of the cases are clearer than others, but it is a definite concern and a high priority. In general, the DEA and HSI kind of took the lead on this larger issue of laundering. But I think one of the things you said earlier was true, that the problem here is that it does cross silos, right? Because there's a criminal part and there's a counterintelligence part. And I found myself sort of, talking to people about the criminal side, and then it led inevitably to questions of state involvement, even if it was just, say, an individual, as opposed to saying the whole state. And that crosses the line into CI, and the opposite with CI, saying, well, people saying, well, we really don't have that much expertise on the organized crime part. And yet what you have here is a convergence of the two, right? And I think more about the Chinese sort of holistic approach to this kind of thing, to intelligence and political influence, than I do. But my impression is that it's untraditional in that all kinds of proxies are used for all kinds of reasons, right? Not just traditional stealing of secrets, but using instruments in the diaspora communities, including, it appears to be, organized crime, to do things like repress dissidents or fund operations or do political influence operations. So I think that is something that is going on in government right now, is trying to bring together, cross those jurisdictional boundaries among agencies, and the interplay, not unlike, I think, with Russian organized crime and intelligence, which are so intertwined as well.
Yeah.
That's something that's going on. And the only other thing I'll say about that on the government policy side is several people said to me, understandably, after 9/11, there had been a reasonably robust knowledge and focus on Asian organized crime in the United States national security community. After 9/11, that faded a bit as resources were understandably diverted to the Islamist terrorism question. And working a case like this one, which was so big and had these triad connections, the DEA and other agents were frustrated in that there wasn't the kind of current robust intelligence that they would have hoped on these kinds of questions. They had to go back to old cases and sort of reconstruct things in order to find the kind of connections we're looking
Now, it does come down to you get what you pay for, and you follow what your priorities are, and sometimes we pay for misses. Before we get to our wrap, I want to kind of bring this together into one of the big topics that's in the news. It's a policy issue, it's a personal issue, it's a community issue, and it has to do with fentanyl and its role in this washing machine that you were looking into. When I talk about fentanyl, it's usually I try to emphasize, I think it's one of the greatest attacks on American families and communities in the history of the United States of America. And it's not one where someone from the Chinese Communist Party comes to a neighborhood and opens up a medicine bag and says, here, have some of these, have some of these. It's part of this previously unthought of nexus of precursor chemicals coming into the cartels moving things over a border. But your work actually adds more sophistication to this, in that there's the whole money side of it together with the product movement part of this. And at least in my estimation, it's impossible for the authorities on each side of this triangle not to know that this stuff is moving and what it's doing. It kind of raises the meta question of, is the Communist Party of China doing this on purpose, or very actively permitting it to go forward because it degrades American communities, because it divides America and makes us less productive, whatever it might be. But before I put all of those words into your mouth, please go back to what you've been working on and thinking on in this nexus. And how does fentanyl fit into this calculus?
Well, certainly, as you say, fentanyl has been, the most prosperous and lethal, new drug to emerge, to ravage the United States in the past decade. And obviously, fentanyl and its precursors were made in largely in the Chinese pharmaceutical industry, and until I believe 2019, legally so. Right, there were some curbs on actual fentanyl, but the precursors still make their way through Mexico. And until that crackdown in 2019. Americans were buying fentanyl basically over the internet and having it sent sometimes by FedEx to the United States. So it was dramatic and brazen, with great, human, costs and remarkable casualties, and almost exclusively in the United States, which is interesting because there's so much drug trafficking of other kinds of drugs in Europe, which I'm very familiar with, heroin and cocaine. So that's just a data point. Now, we try to be very careful and rigorous in this story, and we talked about the fentanyl a bit, but it wasn't our main focus. But obviously, as you said, the laundering and the question of what U.S. officials have said on the record is at least tacit support of the laundering leads you into the question of fentanyl, because much of the laundering now is obviously happening for organizations that deal in fentanyl, because it's so much more prosperous and so much easier to smuggle, right? So, as I said to you, the many high-level and frontline people that we talked to, who talked about the laundering, had felt the same way about fentanyl, and that they suspected that there was at least a passive, if not active, role of the Chinese state in letting this happen. I will say that some of them were absolutely convinced of it, and others said, well, that's what I think, but I don't have the evidence. And we tried, and since the main focus of the story was not fentanyl, we said it that way, and I think it's a very serious charge to make. But as you say, delving into the laundering as we did, it raises inevitable questions in the same kind of way, in terms of an authoritarian state and its ability to control things that are going on in its turf and in its diaspora communities. But what is what is allowing the fentanyl to continue to flow into the United States, and these alliances and this kind, because after all, the precursors are going into Mexico now, right? And those are connections between Mexican and Chinese criminal groups, which are traceable, right? And which people are
Hmm.
looking at. So that was certainly kind of an adjacent, connected issue that we looked at, and which people express suspicions about, and raise very urgent questions about. I don't have the answer, but I think it's something that obviously should be examined closely, given the logic of what we found when it comes to the money laundering.
So, do you think it might be a part three of your series at some point to take a dive into that?
That might be worth looking at it, but it would be these are difficult stories, right? We had. I was surprised because I've worked with the DEA for many years around the world and have had good relationships. For whatever reason, there was a reluctance to talk about this case, which was mostly done. Most of these people had been convicted. Um, Even to talk about something as basically as helping explain money laundering, which in this case is particularly complicated. So a lot of this work was done, uh, with lots of good sources, but not with a whole lot of help. I think part of it may have been that there was a political aspect to this case too, which was again that one of these figures had gone on to meet, with lots of politicians, both Democrat and Republican, but most prominently and remarkably with former President Trump when he was still president. And there was and he was a focus of a counterintelligence investigation by the FBI, and then was also tracked down by the DEA and ultimately arrested, partly because they were seeing all these connections that he had to people in U.S. politics, in addition to Chinese and Latin American organized crime. So I guess there were sensitive aspects to the case. But this is, it opens out into all kinds of directions. And one of the big picture questions, I guess, is the extent to which in China, whether because of widespread corruption, which I think everyone agrees exists, or state policy, or some combination of the two, to what extent is the Chinese state playing a role in this spread of Chinese organized crime around the world in activities like this one?
Absolutely. Well, and it also is a warning signal to a lot of our institutions that we don't focus on this nearly enough. Whether if you're a public figure of any kind in business, politics, or entertainment, you could be someone who gets photobombed by one of these people, and you would have no idea that this dark underworld has just stepped in. Who knows what it brings with you? So it's sort of the stuff of movies in a way. And so get back for a moment to the storyline of the two characters that make the sort of central focus of your two parts so far. I'm just teasing that there might be a third part. That's just me. You didn't commit, but they're two very, very different personalities, and you point this out in your writing. And so one of them is a more quiet, buttoned down, all about business kind of guy, and the other one is the flamboyant guy. He's the one who gets the picture taken with the VIPs or what have you. Talk to us a little bit about the interplay between these two, but also how they become captured and prosecuted. Was it because the flamboyant guy was too flamboyant and he took the whole thing down for both of them? Was it completely separate? But, we're here at the China desk to talk about China and the policy, but you've got a story here. Help bring us to the finish line on the story of these guys. What brought them down?
Sure. It's they're two, as you say, remarkable outsized personalities. They have some similarities in that they have multiple identities, multiple nationalities and documents. Various, some legal and some not. An incredible set of contacts around the world. That they were able, just bouncing, caroming around the world from one scam or criminal enterprise to another. As you said, Tao Yu was more a businessman with organized crime connections who shows up in Mexico and Guatemala, meets Xi because Xi has this side racket selling fraudulent documents. They meet that way. But what his role in helping Xi really grow this laundry business seems to have been connecting him with people in the Chinese elite, because Xi was more of a working class, came from working class immigrant roots. Tao Liu was, had many more sort of connections in the Chinese Communist Party elite in China and Hong Kong and around the world, and was able to connect him with people who were, looking to buy dollars, so to speak. The DEA comes at them from multiple angles. They go after Zhi Li first, basically by catching key people. They get inside the communications of the network with some excellent work. And then once they're inside the communications of the network down in Mexico and Guatemala, they're able to track and pick off the couriers that are industriously moving around the United States with this money. And so they're able to really build this case and assemble the network. They capture his girlfriend at one point in Los Angeles, which gets him inside the WeChat, which is an even better sort of window into the organization. And they're able finally to track down Zhi Li and arrest him in Merida, Mexico, and bring him back to the United States. Once they have him, they're inside of all these devices and all these communications, and they're realizing the magnitude, both in terms of money and global scope of this organization. And they've come across this character, Tao Liu, who's clearly someone who has been with him down in Guatemala and Mexico. But then they're finding all this evidence that Tao Liu has spent the past couple of years in New York, making all kinds of contacts of people in the financial community, people in the United Nations, people in and people obviously in politics, including meeting with the president of the United States, making at least one legal campaign contribution to the GOP that we're aware of, and may have made others, doing some sort of subnational type political influence as well with a prominent Democrat in the state legislature of New York. So they're just fascinated. Who is this individual, and how does he go from being someone who's sneaking across borders and hanging out in casinos laundering money with Zhi Li to being sort of accepted here in U.S. high society, and somehow getting, even though he's publicly wanted in China, is able to get through the defenses and meet not once but twice with the president of the United States. But by the time they focus on him, he's back in Hong Kong, and the pandemic has hit. So he's stuck. He's a globetrotter who can't trot the globe anymore, and they can't get at him, in Hong Kong. So they come up with a great, in the classic tradition of the Special Operations Division of the DEA, which is very good at undercover stings around the world, a great sting where an excellent Chinese-speaking agent gets him on the phone in his high-rise apartment where he's sitting bored and on lockdown in Hong Kong, and convinces him that he's a friend of Zhi Li's who can sell him through a corrupt State Department official, a U.S. passport, and develops a relationship with him over the phone over months. Because the DEA wants Tao Liu because they think, number one, he can answer questions about the money laundering organization. Number two, he can answer questions about the interplay between Chinese organized crime and the Chinese state, because he has all these high-level connections. And number three, what appears to be, attempts at political influence operations. The DEA discovers at this point that the FBI had been separately tracking Tao Liu because of the kind of contacts he was making in the U.S. political community as a counterintelligence target, particularly after they discovered his meetings with President Trump. There's a bit of a debate about whether, the intelligence imperative, which is more to let him continue to operate, the DEA wants to go and catch him and see what he's going to say. But finally, the DEA succeeds in sending a private plane with agents or undercover figures posing as gangsters to pick him up in Hong Kong, and he gets on the plane thinking that he's going to Australia to buy a U.S. passport, which will be, his ticket, his keys to the kingdom to return to the United States, and to launder money. And they land in Guam, which is U.S. territory, and they arrest him. And so they bring him back. All these guys, the two of them were the two main figures, and half a dozen others have all been convicted. But some of these fundamental questions, like the extent of this network's connections to Chinese state officials, and what Tao Liu was doing, meeting the president of the United States and other U.S. political figures and campaign contributors, have yet to be answered publicly. Most of the stuff that we found is not in the court documents, or at least not in the public ones. So as much as we found out, there are still aspects of this story that remain a mystery and perhaps will be clarified in the coming years.
Well, Sebastian, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I think it's a really fascinating story to read and to listen to, but it really does raise a number of really important policy, intelligence, national security, and other kinds of questions that I think are just really worthy of thought and exploration among many, many people in the audience, that whether they have influence in public policy, government, media, whatever it is, there's definitely a lot more to cover and a lot more work to be done in this area. So with that, I hope that the audience has enjoyed today's China Desk conversation. If you have, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and special thank you to Sebastian Rotella for sharing his tremendous and unique perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.